Hey, thanks for checking out The Solid Verbal. Now would be a great time to subscribe to the channel for college football content all off season long.
All right, Dan, let's talk some LSU, shall we? Here to help us do that from the Jordy Culotta Show, it is Jordy Culotta himself. Welcome, sir. Congrats on a big night in LSU Tigers sports with the national championship for the women's basketball team.
Yeah, fellas. First off, thanks for having me. Great production. It's cool to be here, and really looking forward to our conversation. Kim Mulkey in year 2, I think even she would be a little surprised at how fast this happened. I don't think that she was surprised to have a tournament team and a contender, but to wake up today as national champs, I think is surprising to a lot of people. It was a magical run. It was a great season, and I think really when you look at the what is next year for LSU women, a number 1 recruiting class coming in, and really kind of the heartbeat of this team, and Angel Reese coming back for another season. It's kind of fun to think what could be next.
Setting the year 2 bar for Brian Kelly is what we're saying.
Yeah, right. How about Jay
Setting
Johnson, the baseball coach? He's got his team in his second season, number 1 in the country. I mean, a lot of things working out for Scott Woodward's hires right now, the athletic director.
Basketball is actually a good way to start the Brian Kelly conversation, because if you recall, he unexpectedly gets hired away from Notre Dame. Very big news story. Then he gets introed at the basketball game. You know where I'm going with this, Jordy.
Sure.
And that was the fake accent. That was the fake accent moment. The internet goes crazy. Did you have any reaction to that? Did LSU fans have any reaction to that on your show?
You know what, Ty? Really locally, it really kind of brought people behind him.
Really?
I mean, I think once it got out into the national, and I think everybody kind of laughed at it at first, but then it became such a punching bag from a national standpoint that, it turned into kind of, he's our guy. I mean, you've got his back. I mean, people were, really kind of starting to stand up for him and starting to believe in what he was building. I mean, you think back a year ago at this time, they had delayed spring practice because they were putting together a roster. They just didn't have the numbers to get out on the field, and people started to see the work that he was doing and the staff that he was putting together and what people were saying about him nationally, leaving South Bend and coming to Baton Rouge and kind of, stomping on that night, the night that he was introduced, using that as almost kind of the punchline of the joke. I really thought it really was kind of the first portion of the fan base really starting to galvanize behind him.
I will say, as a Notre Dame fan, the quick pivot away from, and this isn't just an LSU thing, this was kind of a national thing, but the quick pivot away from Notre Dame is overrated to Brian Kelly just knows how to win was seemingly overnight, and sometimes in the same breath.
No, it was. And look, I think that Scott Woodward was very calculated at what he wanted in this position. Woodward is a Baton Rouge native. He's an LSU graduate. He left Baton Rouge in 2005 and went out on his own to University of Washington and Texas A&M and made some really big time hires there. He knew he ultimately wanted the LSU athletics director job. This was his dream job. He wanted to come home. He wanted to run the university's athletic department. And there may even be higher aspirations for him here in the state of Louisiana. But this was the first of it. And he knew that he was only going to get one of these chances to hire the football coach. I think that when he got here, he saw some things with Orgeron, and that was the magical season. He got here in 19, almost like a month and a half before the start of the season, and just kind of buckled up for that ride, which was magical. But I think he even saw some leaks at that point where he thought, hey, I may have to replace Orgeron sooner rather than I initially thought. So he started to make the list, and I really think Brian Kelly was way, way up there. It was obvious that Jimbo was a choice just because of their relationship. But, once that fell through, I think he moved to Kelly, and, Kelly was his guy. And I there's some prerequisites that you have to check off to be a Brian Kelly candidate. And, I think that Kelly behind, Jimbo for Scott Woodward's sake was really the safest of all that he needed on the job.
What were those prerequisites, by the way?
You got to recruit. You got to be able to recruit because this is a absolute feeding frenzy of recruits. You had to play defense in recruiting. I mean, you've got to keep Saban out, Kirby Smart out, Jimbo Fisher out, and you got to keep Lane Kiffin out. All of these people who are trying to come feed off the state. So first things first, you got to be able to recruit. And what Woodward was looking for was consistency. Right. I think that there's a, kind of sub boxes that you need to check under that box, but just LSU has been on a roller coaster ride since 2001, really, of just highs and some low lows. I think what Woodward was looking for was, hey, turn this program into a national contender year in, year out, because you've got the recruiting ground, you have the facilities, you're in the league, you've got all the resources, you've got all the backing that you need. Now it's time to do it consistently. And I think, that's what he wanted out of Brian Kelly. And here in year one, he seemed to, really play it all out on the field.
Yeah, the vibe on Scott Woodward when this became an opening, this guy's a big game hunter. That seemed to be the national conversation of people who are very connected to all things college football coaching. He's a big game hunter. He's not gonna aim for second tier. He's gonna try and go all out. He gets Brian Kelly, 9-3 regular season. They win the West, go to the championship game, obviously lose to Georgia, go to the bowl game, destroy Purdue. All told, a pretty good season. How would you grade it, A through F?
Yeah, I would grade it B+. I think what he took over, I don't think he even realized how far back they were set. The locker room was a disaster. The support system was a disaster. The academics was in the toilet. I think that was the part that he really didn't realize, that from an APR standpoint, they had to dig themselves out of the graveyard. They had to put in some real policies and principles early on to get everybody, just buying in. He was telling stories at the beginning of this spring of, last year at this time, he was telling people not to take knees at practice, to keep your helmet on, to, control your emotions, just kind of the little things in building the program. And it's quite evident when you go out there this year that all of that stuff is in place. It's much more organized. People understand where they're supposed to be and when they're supposed to be there. I think that's what LSU was looking for, really. I mean, as simple as that is, I think they just needed some structure. They needed organization. They needed accountability. And, he brought all of that. He instituted what they call SWAT teams, which is where you've got, guys on the team that are leading 10-man groups. So everybody's really accountable to one another, and everything is graded, from going to class to opening up doors for people in front of you to, all of these things that go into not making you a really good football player, just making you a good human being. And I think ultimately that's what they wanted to do initially, was just, hey, look, clean the program up. Get everybody buying into a certain direction of where it's headed, and then, put the football players around them.
What was the immediate stamp on the field that in retrospect you can look back and say that was really shrewd, that was really savvy, because obviously you mentioned how thin that roster was. And so is it specific guys, obviously with Jayden Daniels being the headliner, that he brings in the portal? Is it assistant hires? When you look at the better parts of that B+ off the field or just on the field, whatever, what are you like, that was the move? Those were the series of moves last spring, last summer. Obviously, holding on to Harold Perkins is pretty large.
Sure, absolutely.
What are those moves? You're like, Brian Kelly absolutely nailed this.
Transformation of the offensive line overnight, really.
Yep.
The way that he was able to do that in the transfer portal, for whatever reason, Louisiana, you can leave LSU's football facility and travel 30 miles in any direction and find a 4 or 5-star defensive back, wide receiver, running back, or defensive tackle. They've got those in bunches down here. They have not rarely had offensive linemen. So LSU really has struggled to consistently recruit that position. Kelly, that is a strength of his. He turned that unit from very questionable last year at this time to a strong point at the beginning of the season. You could see that they needed some time to gel. They needed some time to play together because you had guys that were transferred in, you had guys that were recruited in. But ultimately, he went and found 5 that he could put out there that he believed in. And by the midpoint in the season, they were protecting Daniels. They were opening up holes for the running backs, and they were a reliable unit. Give it a year later now, fellas, and they've recruited a couple of more 5-stars into the program. You've got 2 guys that are coming back that started as a freshman. Their transfer class on the offensive line was fantastic. So, like I said, a year later, a position group that was very much a cause for concern, you look at going into Kelly's second year, is maybe the strongest on the team.
How do you think that should affect the vision for the offense? There was a lot of positive to take away from the offense last year, especially as the season went on. When you look at what LSU was not able to do on offense, it was not a consistent running game on the ground, especially with running backs. A lot of it came down to Jayden Daniels. And it was a struggle at times popping bigger plays downfield in the passing game. Do you think that evolution, that depth of the offensive line will make this offense a little bit more versatile this fall?
I do. I do. I think that, Jayden Daniels was the only quarterback for LSU last season. Really. He had to play because he was the only one that allowed you to keep the play alive when it broke down. And that's what the coaching staff was really game planning for, was that they didn't trust the offensive line yet. They said that they had to put a quarterback back there that if they took a 3-5 play action type drop, that, look, you got to keep him upright for a certain amount of time. But if he can't, he's got to be able to get out of there and wiggle out of there and get into space. And Daniels did that fantastic. And you saw, really him throw the ball better as the season progressed. And he really started to believe in that skill and really was doing it at a very high rate. But then you saw the difference of when Garrett Nussmeier got into the game in the SEC championship, where the offensive line at that point had become trusted. They had become a stronger part of the team. And Nussmeier got in there and look, they just let him fling it. They said, look, get in the gun and throw the ball down the field to these NFL wide receivers that you've got on the outside, which people believed going into the year was really going to be the identity of the offense, was, making big plays and getting the plays of these skill guys. And you saw that kind of happen against Georgia, where Malik Neighbors is catching, he's catching deep pass routes that he's turning into big plays and changing the scoreboard. Kayshawn made some plays that day. You saw some of these underclass wide receivers like Brian Thomas really have big days. So, when you think about, well, if you trust the offensive line and you've got an arm that's as live as Nussmeier's is, and you've got playmakers as big and as strong as you've got on the outside, well, then you can play like that if you want to. Right. I mean, I think the depth and the evolution of the offensive line has kind of given LSU's offensive staff the security that says, hey, you're versatile now. I mean, you can line up there and you can play power football if you want, but you can also, you can stand back there and throw for 400 a game, with the skill that you have on the outside and the protection that you have up front. So it will be interesting. I think that this is a quarterback battle. I don't think
I was going to ask. Yeah. Okay, so Nussmeier, in limited time during the regular season, looks a little bit cold coming in relief and doesn't do much. Shreds Georgia coming in with an injured Jayden Daniels, and shreds a completely gutted Purdue roster. What are we talking about in terms of the meaning of those things?
Yeah, look, I think it's meaning very much towards this immediate competition. I think spring is probably as intense as this competition will be, because Brian Kelly wants to see, how much progress has each made. I think both were kind of sent away in a short offseason that says, when you get back in spring, Jayden, your arm needs to be a little bit more consistent and stronger. And, Nussmeier, you need to make better decisions. If you're going to be a starting quarterback, you got to protect the football. And, Daniels did that almost obsessively, right? I mean, he almost held on to it too long, while Nussmeier almost has that Brett Favre quality where you're like, bro, what are you looking at? What? Don't put it in that space. That's not going to work. This is probably as intense as that competition is going to be, because Kelly knows once he gets to the fall, he's got to be working around one guy, and he's got two guys that he really believes in. I think that, this is as close as this competition has ever been, right? I think that it was probably not as close as people thought it was last year, but right now it probably is neck and neck of, you're really deciding internally, if you're LSU, who do you want to be? Right? Like, what style do you want to play? Because while Nussmeier is athletic enough to, play with his feet, he's not Jayden Daniels. I mean, Daniels he's the fastest LSU quarterback I've ever seen, really. And I say that, with all due respect. I mean, it's incredible to see him in the open field, how fast he is. So it's a weapon. And I think that's what LSU's offensive staff, Mike Denbrock, Frank Wilson, Cortez Hankton, Joe Sloan, and obviously Brian Kelly, are deciding right now, what's the identity of the team going to be in 2023? Because either way you go, it'll be polarizingly different.
What else is up in the air right now, spring and beyond, in terms of position battles? Obviously, a late coaching change with Jamar Cain. Yeah. What is What are the question marks right now that seem to be the biggest?
Well, that hit him, that kind of sideswiped him. I don't think that they were anticipating that. Kane's done a really good job of recruiting more nationally. He's brought in some guys from outside. Deshaun Womack's a 5-star guy from Maryland that, is probably going to step in and play for BJ Ojulari's spot that he leaves behind. And, Ojulari will probably be, somewhere in the late first, early second type selection. And then, you've got some other new faces there. So they've got to replace that spot. They're looking for some depth at linebacker still. I think the pickup of the offseason really was Omar Spate out of Oregon State. Man, he's played a ton of football. He was a captain up there for the Beavers. He comes in, he's kind of a plug and play guy. And really more importantly than anything, he allows you to keep Harold Perkins in his position where he can play in space. Now, Perkins has been cross-training a little bit here in spring at the middle spot, and I think that they're going to have some lineups next year where he may be out on the field in the middle, but he'll still be playing in space. I think ultimately, right, they're just trying to find ways to get him into the open, but I think that Omar Spate at linebacker really was a key pickup, and obviously somebody that's going to have to develop and play there so you can continue to play to your strengths. Defensive backs, another one. They were able to pick up Denver Harris, out of Texas A&M, right, who's a 5-star and really at last season's midpoint was an All-American. He had some trouble at the end of his days at Texas A&M, but he comes in, man, he looks the part. Right. I mean, LSU's been known for DBU guys like Pat Peterson and Morris Claiborne and, on down the list of guys that, even recently of Christian Fulton and Derek Stingley Jr. Man, he kind of looks like the next one. I mean, just physically when he steps off the bus, he looks like a NFL defensive back. So, I still think DB, they've got some questions that they need answers, but you're starting to see some things really start to shake out.
It's an extremely frozen take to say, no team is happier with a single person on their defense than LSU is that Harold Perkins is wearing LSU colors. Did they have any idea what they had in Harold Perkins? Obviously, 5-star, wanted by every single major program in the country, but to come in and look as polished and as comfortable and as instinctive, forget even the physical gifts, right, but just the know-how that Harold Perkins had intellectually on the football field. Did the defensive staff have any concept going in?
You got to see it on the field before it plays out, but there were tales coming out of the summer workouts last year and some of the stuff that was happening in the preseason where, guy like Frank Wilson, who's the associate head coach here, who recruited guys like Leonard Fournette and Tyrann Mathieu and, on down the line, Patrick Peterson to this program. I mean, he was saying some things about Harold Perkins very early on that you were saying like, whoa, I mean, that's pretty high regard. What I mean? Like, you don't just kind of kick that around. And then, you go to week one and you're like, well, where is he? I mean, like we've heard all of this stuff about him, but if you were paying attention in that Florida State game, he's on the kickoff team and he makes every play. Every kick, every tackle in the kickoff team, he's the last one to get up off the pile. And then he made a play against Auburn, fellows, where he reacted to this ball in the air and he snagged it out of the air. And from that point on, I think everybody looked around and said, who cares whether he's ready or not? You have to have him out there. And it just turned into kind of like Tyrann Mathieu type weeks where you're like, what's he going to do next? How is he going to, what's the crazy thing and like the coaches and teammates and stuff will tell you, like, he'd probably be the best running back on the team.
Sure.
If you've seen his high school highlights, it's scary. I mean, he did everything at his high school. I mean, he made the hamburgers and hot dogs at halftime. He drove the bus. I mean, he returned punts, he returned kicks. He was the safety. He was the linebacker. He was the quarterback. He was the running back. And this is a big time Texas high school. It wasn't like he was tucked away in some small town. It was
right.
So you knew when he got here, how would this translate? I don't think anybody could anticipate. Look, LSU's had a lot of dominant freshmen come through here. A lot of them, Matthew's one of them. Mm-hmm. Harold Perkins is as good as I've ever seen. I can't say he's the best, but I mean, he's as good as we've ever seen down here. I mean, he's so impactful. It's not if, it's when he affects the game.
Yeah. Incredible. I want to go back to something you said earlier, Jordy. You mentioned about Brian Kelly instilling a sense of accountability among the roster. What I like from what we saw at LSU last season And there were some warts. You and Dan discussed them, right? But it reminded me a little bit of when he first took over Notre Dame, because that was not a perfect roster by any stretch, but you could feel it kind of building from week to week to week. You could feel that there was a sense of buy-in among the players on the roster. I don't know what that exact moment was for LSU this season. It probably correlates pretty well to when it really clicked with Jayden Daniels, but there was this sense of it's getting better. They're getting more organized. Things are starting to stabilize. Beyond the accountability piece that you mentioned earlier, if you had to describe the culture of this team, what Kelly has now put into place, and how you see that quote unquote buy-in taking place among the guys on the roster, how would you describe that to people who aren't as familiar?
Look, I would give this stat, and this is a really in college football these days. When you look up, there is people fleeing football programs. People are leaving for no reasons, right? I mean, the age of the transfer portal has created the great excuse. I can do this right now. I mean, I can, I hate where I'm at noon. By 12:30, I can be somewhere else. And after LSU, after LSU had hired Brian Kelly, and he had really kind of settled his feet on the job and began to build the roster, had began to pay attention to building the roster at that part of the process. Nobody transferred out.
Right.
Nobody left. And I think that when you have a first-year head coach, you almost have to have almost a built-in type of insurance that you're going to lose guys, right? I mean, like there's going to be some turnover. And once he really introduced himself to the team and created these boundaries and, kind of accountability and leadership principles of what he was building the team on, nobody left. And everybody that you talked to had a different mental outlook on it. LSU, when you would talk to their players a couple of years ago, it almost felt like a job before it was a job. Now they're getting paid, but it felt like it was just slugging through mud every day of showing up and wondering what it was going to be and where people were going to go and, who was going to be leading you and what the message was going to be. Now, when you show up and you know that, hey, if my teammate's not there, he's going to be docked for that. It's going to hold him accountable. And I got to show up to make sure that I'm not the guy that costs my SWAT team the opportunity, and people are showing up to work with a smile on their face. Well, you're building a whole new community. You're building a whole new culture. You're building a whole new vibe around the field, around the building. And, I think that caught on pretty quick with Brian Kelly. I mean, they didn't need to get to the fall to buy in. I mean, there was big buy-in around March, April, and May of last year that by the time the summer came around, LSU you could feel like they were kind of feeling themselves. You were kind of like, what is this about? Where is this coming from? Because they've got so many question marks, but you would talk to people kind of internally and you're like, I'm telling you, you better watch out, you better heads up. They're going to surprise some people. And it's, to see the way that they played by the time they got rolling into November, it was like, damn, I mean, I guess this is who they are.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when we were doing season previews, we looked at the roster and it was obvious. This is a very good roster. This is a good team, but there were a lot of questions. New coach, quarterback, right? I mean, we
ton of transfers,
right? There was a lot that we didn't know, but there were plenty of reasons to be optimistic. What are they selling when they're out on the road now? When they're doing their recruiting pitches, what are they selling this new version of LSU football? How does that differ, if at all, from the previous regime when they were out on the road?
I think Scott Woodward, what he sold to Brian Kelly more than anything was that it's a true brand name program. I think LSU's always had a seat at the table, or at least the last 20 years has had a seat at the table of the big boys and kind of the blue bloods, but maybe a little bit of, sitting at the other side of the cool kids, kind of wondering how do they fit in. And I think what Woodward was really pushing towards Kelly is that, hey, we deserve to be here. And you're the guy that's going to make us a consistent buy-in of this is who we are. This is LSU football. This is what it comes with. And I think, they have taken that and really taken it to the road. I think you're seeing that through social media of the way that they're recruiting these guys of, LSU is as resourceful, as funded, as healthy of a recruiting ground, has every resource that you need from a coaching, facility, training standpoint, academic support standpoint that you can get anywhere. And, I think that they're starting to shop that more nationally but by obviously paying attention to the in-state talent that can, win champion. Nick Saban opened up and created the blueprint down here. When he got here, he looked around and said, what the hell has everybody been doing? This place is a monster. I mean, if you just build a wall around New Orleans alone, I mean, at that time, like Ed Reed was playing at Miami and Reggie Wayne was like, how is this happening? I mean, these guys need to be playing at LSU. And once he built that fence and showed like, hey guys, you don't have to go, you don't have to go shop the country, just win in your backyard first. And that'll be the nucleus of all the championship runs you go on. And that has played out, even 23 years later. I mean, Saban's model still exists up here. So, I mean, down here. So, I think that there's a much pointed effort on winning in the state with a national brand and a big name behind you.
Can you speak at all to how Nick Saban has driven folks in the SEC, especially folks in the SEC West, crazy?
Sure.
Over the time of his tenure at Alabama, because we've seen every coach in the SEC turn over at least once in the span of time that he's been on his historic run at Bama. What has it been like from the LSU standpoint? Of course, they got one in 2019, but I don't know, just broadly speaking, what has that been like from your perspective?
Well, not only have they turned him over, they've tried to replace him with his guys. I mean, everybody's kind of looked for him and see if you can't almost model. It's been more brutal for LSU, and specifically, later it's gotten a little bit better. And really, past the first couple of years of him being Bama's head coach, people got over the emotional part of it. But early on for LSU fans, I mean, it was brutal. I mean, they had a billboard leaving Alabama's team hotel, with just some pretty bad stuff aimed at Saban in the first game, back in 2008. I mean, this thing was it was hot, man. I mean, it was a boiling type temperature there for a minute. But, I mean, once he was able to establish his program at Alabama, people at LSU knew like everybody's in trouble. Everybody's in trouble, and specifically LSU, because he understood how healthy Louisiana talent was. And he started to come in here and really cherry pick who he wanted under Les Miles. And it cost Les Miles his job. I mean, Miles would make the LSU Alabama game the Super Bowl every year, where it had a bye week before. So it had a 2-week buildup, and Miles would never run from it. I mean, he would say that this is the biggest game and this is the year and LSU's prepared. And then they would get into that game and ultimately they would lose it, whether it would be in heartbreaking fashion at the end or it would be in a blowout, when he showed up to Tuscaloosa in 15 with Leonard Fournette and just came running him into a brick wall, where it just, once you left that game, the season deflated. I mean, if you look at LSU Arkansas's record in the Les Miles era, Arkansas really started to command that series late because Miles could never win the Bama game, and it was always the week after Alabama. So LSU would consistently lay an egg that week. I mean, there was no real purpose. All the superstars were kind of sitting out of the game. Nobody was dressed out. I mean, it was because they had put all of this stock in trying to beat Saban and beat Alabama and slay the dragon that it just ultimately it ended up costing him. I mean, they put so much emotion into it. I mean, you saw Orgeron in 19 when he won the game. He's crying on midfield. He's crying. Right, I mean, that was a lot of what that was. Brian Kelly, the same way, when he was asked about it, I mean, at his introductory press conference, why did you take the LSU job? I came down here to play teams like Alabama and play coaches like Nick Saban. I mean, that's what, and as soon as it was over after he beat him, that's what I got here. That's why I came here. That's why I took this job. So, his mark has been left indelibly on not only Alabama's program, but programs all over the Southeastern Conference, all over college football, really.
Is it almost an advantage that Brian Kelly was a pseudo outsider to the South, that he doesn't come in with that baggage, right? That Ed Orgeron knows the weight of beating Alabama in the SEC. Obviously over the years, Les Miles understands the weight of the pressure of Alabama, and not just Alabama, but eventually A&M and Ole Miss and all these other schools where, you come in with so much scar tissue on all of these matchups. Florida, of course. So Brian Kelly comes in only coaching in the Midwest from the Northeast. Do you think that him coming in with clear eyes was a certain advantage.
100%. I think very refreshing for Scott Woodward when he saw that in the process of, hey, he's going to embrace this stuff. You know,
Right.
I mean, Miles was more intimidated by it as time grew on, and Ogeron after his third season just became a train wreck. So I mean, it never could really get a run of consistency under it. But to see where Kelly kind of embraces that, look, it was the same thing that happened with Nick Saban in 1999. He was an outsider. I mean, that's one thing that LSU is very guilty of, is that they've got a lot of people that have been collecting checks, doing the same thing at state jobs for, X number of years. And when you ask them to change the policy or change the procedure, the first excuse is, well, that's not how we do it here. We've been doing it for this long. And, that
Right.
really turned Saban off. I mean, there was tales coming out of Saban just kind of walking around like Ari Gold on Entourage with like a water gun, just lighting people up. Like, you're done. You know what I mean? Like, you're done.
Yeah.
Get out of here. Pack your stuff. Like, get out of here. I mean, it's just not going to work like that anymore. I mean, it's not going to be that way. And, Saban left in 2004, and that kind of found its way back into the system by the time that 2021 and 2022 had rolled around. And you go get somebody like Brian Kelly from, totally outside. I mean, I think he had no idea what he was stepping into. And, I mean, you guys are based way outside of Louisiana, but I'm sure you've heard some of the tales of Louisiana politics.
Of course.
At the heart of Louisiana politics is LSU football. I mean, like that is
Go back to Huey Long.
That is the main recipe of Louisiana in politics. So, I think Kelly stepped in here and probably 2 months in was like, where the hell am I? You know what I mean? Like, this is nuts.
But
I mean,
Kelly is a politician, right? He's been a
Absolutely.
politician his entire career.
So I think once he realized that, hey, this is a lot more than the football. The Notre Dame, it's, I'm the football coach, and there's a lot that comes with that. At LSU, you can be the football coach 12 Saturdays in the fall, but outside of that, you gotta kind of play the role for 365 days a year as kind of the politician, where people are going to come up to you and want favors and shake hands and pictures and all this stuff. And I think, Kelly has really embraced that, at least early on here.
How has that looked on the trail? And you mentioned the politics. That goes along with high school coaches. That goes along with boosters. And it's just every school is its own different universe. But how deeply has he been able to dive into Louisiana recruiting, Louisiana high school, Louisiana 7-on, East Texas 7-on? Like, what has he done every single thing necessary in his short time there to sort of lay that foundation?
Absolutely. Yeah. He's put the right people around. He's gotten some guys that are connected to the Southeast, specifically Louisiana. Frank Wilson was a huge hire for him. Wilson left a sitting head coaching position at McNeese to take the associate head coach at LSU and come back and be the top assistant over here. And, he's really kind of considered the godfather of the state. I mean, everybody knows him. All the high school coaches know him. All the players know him. I mean, everything's going to really run through him. So to get a guy like him early on sewn up, I thought was a very big deal for Kelly, on the job, and has really kind of filtered down. One of the things that I thought really said of how serious Kelly is about this job was removing Brian Polian as the recruiting coordinator this offseason. You talk about politics, and there's been a lot of politics around this move of, make sure the language is correct of how it's said. But at the end of the day, Polian didn't have the option of coming back. I mean, he was never going to come back as the recruiting coordinator at LSU. It just was a bad fit. You saw how bad of a fit the special teams coordinator was once it played out on the field. And, I think Kelly behind closed doors, whether he caught it from somebody or whether he realized himself that, hey, look, Nick Saban's not doing anybody any favors in Tuscaloosa. Kirby Smart's not hiring any of his friends in Athens. I can't put a coordinator role on a guy that may not be this qualified for the job. And you got to make sure that you're maximizing all of those 10 positions. So I think really that move more than anything told me how serious he is on winning, because I know that had to be a difficult conversation for him. That's a good friend of his. They respect one another. He's kept him on to make sure that he's got, some sort of title and role within the program. But, make no mistake about it. That conversation initially was, they're moving on. LSU is moving on because they've got to find the best role and best position, best guy that fits that position, so LSU can maximize, their output in the fall.
How far away is LSU from Brian Kelly 2.0, his vision for the roster, his vision for the gears and pulleys that run a program. You talk about incremental growth and changing things changing the way things were. The roster still very much is relying on transfers. The roster still is very much coached by that first wave of coaches and analysts. How far off is LSU from his grand vision?
Nick Saban, Ed Ogeron, and Les Miles won national championships in year 3 at LSU. I think that there is a model in place that shows that you can win here very early. I think winning the SEC West for Brian Kelly in year 1 was a little advanced. When you talk about a timeline. So I would look right now. We talked about those policies and procedures in the organization, very evident when you step out onto a spring practice field and see that, after seeing them implement them last year at this time. So, that part's really kind of taking care of itself. That's really the organization already running its own when it comes to that portion of the program. You're starting to see the transfer numbers slim down, and you're starting to see more emphasis on high school recruiting, which Kelly said is always going to be the lifeline of adding new blood to the program. So I would say that we're looking at it. I would say that you're probably staring at the midseason point here of year 2 and going into year 3 of, Kelly really having a full grasp and ownership of the program being 100% his, where, they cleared it probably takes about 200 people back office to run LSU football, right? All in all, everybody, they probably turned over 90% of them. There was a very small amount that made it through in that coaching change of Ogeron to Kelly. And so you're starting to see all of those systems and all of those, department heads that are now overseeing certain areas like the weight program and nutrition and academic counseling and, physical therapy and, all that goes into the rehabbing and training parts of it, that are really, people are used to it now. It's a year in. People understand where they're supposed to be, when they're supposed to be there. Like I said, on the field, that's kind of playing out as well, on the practice field as well.
Who are the new names, be it spring, summer, fall, that if you asked the deepest and most passionate fan would make his or her ears tingle right now? Yeah,
look, there is a defensive back in Tolian, I can't remember I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name, but his first name, that has showed his versatility, that Taviano is his last name. And he came out of Texas, a 5-star guy that really, from a defensive back standpoint, kind of looks the part, feels like he's going to play early. But, they've got a lot of guys coming in here that I think are going to play that may not be name recognized, household names. They had a lot of turnover from a lot of role players. So they were able to go out and really kind of turn over this defensive line, and bring guys in like Jordan Jefferson out of West Virginia. They were able to bring a couple of guys home from some other schools around the SEC that I think are going to play. And then obviously when you talk about this freshman class, they've got a couple of tight ends that I think, we saw Mason Taylor, the son of Jason Taylor, last year really kind of step onto the scene at LSU and become one of their primary threats down the stretch. He had to play out of necessity. He was good enough, by no means am I saying, but he had to play early. If you remember, LSU gave up the blocked field goal against Florida State to tie the game at the end. He was the true freshman playing the end spot. He was out of position. He shouldn't have been there, right? That was just kind of that was a bad piece of planning, special teams coach, right? Like we just talked about. And they've really built some depth at the tight end spot. They went out and got some guys. They made a flip on signing day for a big time player that's going to come in and play. So, they signed 4 tight ends in this class. If you go back and watch Brian Kelly, you guys know the history of Kelly in the tight end position.
He does like the tight end. He does
once a year, once a year, there's somebody coming out of his program that's going to play on Sunday. So I think they'll be getting back to that pretty quickly.
Let's get you out of here on this, Jordy. LSU's got to play the SEC West schedule, so that is never easy. However, I looked over it before we hit record. I think there's a very realistic possibility that LSU starts this campaign 8-0. They go into that road tilt against Alabama undefeated, because other than Alabama, other than maybe Florida State, most of the teams in this slate are in flux. to varying degrees, right? For what?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
But I mean, they missed Georgia, they missed Tennessee, at least in the regular season. What are your expectations? What are realistic expectations for year 2? And if we're not talking purely in terms of how many games they won, what represents progress?
Well, look, I think that the most pivotal part of the season and the most pivotal game of the season is Florida State. I mean,
Week 1, yeah, of course.
I mean, I really and truly, I think that when you look at this game and the opportunity that LSU has there, I really think that whoever wins that game could wake up Monday morning number 1 in the country. Now, I think that you look at that weekend, they'll both be preseason top 6 or 7. Maybe even top 5.
They both have returning quarterbacks.
They both got returning quarterbacks. They both have coaches that are now secure. They both have brands that feel like they're about to bust out. They're both on similar tracks last season. I mean, not only did they play in week 1 and the game came down to the last play of the game when a field goal was blocked to force overtime, there were a lot of bowl projections that had them possibly meeting up in the postseason because they were really kind of on an identical track. So I think when you look at this opening weekend game, there's none more attractive, but there's none with more that you'll be able to take away from it. And, at that point of the year, how many times do we see teams that are within the top 5 have the biggest win and wake up and be number 1 in the country? I really think that this is the type of game that could really, kind of catapult whoever comes out of there with a winner into that record, like you said, of, a fast start where you pull into Tuscaloosa undefeated and you're looking at a big time matchup because of what that can do from you for a confidence standpoint. I know a lot of people are, very disappointed and looking for another shot of the way that game ended last season, and really felt like they had a really good team to go play with. They lost one of their best defenders early in that game in Mason Smith. And, you could see when you go back to it, and especially watching Brian Kelly now coach, 12, 13 games as LSU's coach, you go back and watch that one. He was trying to find his footing. You know what I mean? Like if you go back to that halftime interview, they're like, what's going on? He's like, I don't know. They're like, what's going on? He's like, I don't know. I mean, like it was just kind of like he was kind of looking around thinking, man, this isn't Notre Dame anymore. It just, whatever it was, it kind of took him a little bit to catch his footing. So, I think that LSU is very much looking forward to that rematch. And like I said, I think that it could be the swing game of the year. I really do. When you go back and kind of judge that schedule after it's done, you look at that Florida State week 1 game. I mean, think about what it would have done for LSU's season last year if they would have won it.
Absolutely. And they could have won that game. They perhaps should have won that game.
Absolutely.
Jordy Culotta from the Jordy Culotta Show. Tell folks where they can find you and all your good work.
Well, I appreciate it, fellas. Easiest way to do it is at Culotta Show on social media. So whether that is Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, any platform that you are on, you can find us there. And obviously on YouTube, right? Every morning we're there from 7 to 9 a.m. And we've got programming coming out Monday through Friday. A lot of it's centered around South Louisiana sports like the Pelicans and the Saints, but really more LSU. So if you're interested in LSU and you may be living outside of Louisiana or outside of our LSU listening base, give us a try. You can find us on YouTube. The easiest way to do it is just search at Culotta Show to keep up with what we got going on.
Very good. Well, look, we appreciate your insight, your wisdom, and of course, all your time. We'll have to do it again soon as we hopefully get a little bit closer to college football season. We're like inside 150 days now to week 1. So
That's right.
We'll be here before you know it.
Hey, LSU's got a good baseball team, so the spring and summer kind of cruises by, right? When baseball season's done, you can look up, it's midsummer, and you're about just about 5 weeks away. So
it's good to be busy,
Perfect.
Right?
That's right. You guys have a great time. Thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate this platform, and you guys do a great job, and it was cool being here. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Jordy.
Our pleasure.